deixar o Antônio Carlos coordenar. Eu vou usar o chat privado para me comunicar com vocês se precisar. Tá aqui à direita.
Bom, gente. E você... Bom, a gente pede para você aqui alguma coisa. Você fica atento aí para ver se ela consegue entrar, não é isso?
Já estamos ao vivo. Boa tarde a todos. Nós estamos oficialmente abrindo o segundo Congresso da Associação Brasileira de Estudos do Século XVIII. Nós estamos aqui com a presença da professora Maria das Graças de Souza, que é a nossa atual presidenta da ABES. Nós estamos aqui com a presença da professora Penelope Corfield, que é a atual presidenta da International Society XVIII. Infelizmente, nós estamos com algum problema técnico que ela não pode, que nós não podemos vê-la, mas nós podemos ouvi-la, né, por enquanto. Então, nós vamos fazer do seguinte, nós vamos proceder da seguinte maneira. Eu vou, enquanto organizador, eu vou falar 2 minutos apenas para dar as boas-vindas e fazer os agradecimentos iniciais. Na sequência, professora, eu vou passar a palavra à professora Maria das Graças, enquanto presidenta da nossa sociedade, e, em terceiro lugar, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Penelope Corfield, que vai fazer a nossa conferência de abertura inicial. Então, a minha função aqui é simplesmente agradecer pela presença de todos vocês, e, sobretudo, agradecer aquelas pessoas que colaboraram para que este evento, para que este congresso se tornasse realidade, não obstante tantas dificuldades, né? Dificuldades sanitárias, técnicas, financeiras, etc. Então, eu gostaria de vivamente agradecer, em primeiro lugar, a professora Maria das Graças, que começou essa nossa aventura de uma sociedade do século XVIII, há 8 anos atrás, na verdade um pouco antes, e ela vai recapitular um pouco, rememorar, né, essa criação. Então, pela confiança a mim depositada, ao grupo de pesquisa de Ética e Filosofia Política aqui da UFES, que organizou esse evento. Eu gostaria de agradecer a professora Penelope Corfield, a presidenta, a nossa anfitriã, que vai abrir o nosso congresso oficialmente, né, mais tarde. Gostaria de agradecer vivamente ao professor Marcos Balieiro, que é meu parceiro e meu amigo, nosso coordenador do programa, que desde o início topou a tarefa. Agradecer ao professor Tomás Kawalsch, nosso secretário de comunicação. Eu sempre brinco que Tomás é o nosso... faz tudo, né? Ele não é só secretário de comunicação, mas é um pouco tudo, mãos à obra, assim. Agradecer vivamente a professora Lília França e a professora Cássia, elas me ajudaram demais na elaboração de problemas técnicos, de cartaz, de caderno de resumos. Ontem à noite, 11 horas da noite, a gente estava conversando ainda sobre questões técnicas, né, de última hora. Agradecer a turma do apoio aqui, os nossos alunos da graduação, os nossos alunos de pós-graduação, a Marina, faço questão de nomeá-los, Marina Santos, Renata Ribeiro e Aron Magalhães, Marina Silva e Diego Nascimento, são os nossos alunos de graduação e de pós-graduação que estão colaborando conosco. E agradecer a todos os colegas, os amigos que aceitaram o nosso convite. Além da professora Penelope, participarão amanhã a professora Silvia Tati, da Itália, na terça-feira a professora Custódia, vários amigos nossos da Argentina, uns 4 ou 5 vão participar nesse meio tempo, e os colegas nossos aqui, os amigos do Brasil, de todas as regiões do país, e, claro, sem contar os nossos colegas do Departamento de Filosofia, a quem agradeço vivamente. É isso, gente, é só agradecimento, né? E, ao mesmo tempo, pedir desculpas, porque esse âmbito técnico ocorre esses problemas técnicos como esse que nós estamos percebendo agora, né? Eu passo a palavra, então, à professora Maria das Graças para a fala dela. Por favor, Maria.
Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Bem-vindas, bem-vindos todos ao segundo Congresso da Associação Brasileira de Estudos do século XVIII. Eu quero dizer que é com muito prazer e com muita alegria que nós abrimos esse nosso segundo Congresso. Quero saudar e agradecer à professora Penelope Corfield por sua disponibilidade, por sua boa vontade em participar do nosso congresso. Para nós é uma alegria muito grande e também uma honra ter conosco a presidenta da Sociedade Internacional de Estudos do século XVIII. Penelope, je vais vous parler en français comme toujours, parce que mon anglais n'est pas bon. Alors, je disais que je suis très contente et c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir c'est pour nous aussi un honneur de recevoir au Brésil, même à distance, pour nous parler de notre second congrès de l'Association brésilienne. Merci beaucoup, Penelope, merci beaucoup. Bom, eu vou fazer um breve histórico da nossa associação, rapidamente, e tecer alguns comentários, para, em seguida, passar a palavra à nossa convidada de honra, a professora Penélope. A nossa Associação Brasileira de Estudos do século XVIII, ABES 18, foi fundada em 2014. Portanto, a sua existência formal é já de 8 anos, né? Na qual eu permaneci na presidência por 2 gestões, como vocês se lembram. Antes disso, houve uma Associação Brasileira de Estudos do século XVIII, que foi fundada em 1984. Faziam parte desta antiga sociedade, o professor Rouanet, a professora Anita Novinsky. Essa antiga sociedade realizou algumas atividades, durou um certo tempo e depois interrompeu a sua programação, de modo que, durante alguns anos, o Brasil não tinha mais uma sociedade de estudos do século XVIII. Foi, então, antes de 2014, que eu fui convidada, por indicação de um colega parceiro nosso, professor Sebastião Charles, do Canadá, que indicou meu nome para uma função no Comitê Executivo da Sociedade Internacional, da CIES. O comitê tem um dispositivo de convidar um membro que é chamado membro cooptado, um membro, portanto, que não foi eleito, para participar das atividades do Comitê Executivo. Eu aceitei a função, comecei a comparecer nas reuniões do Comitê Executivo, e a intenção dos colegas da CIEDES é convidar pesquisadores nesta condição para estimular a criação de novas sociedades em países que ainda não as têm. No biênio seguinte, eu me tornei membro eleito do Comitê Executivo, onde fiquei até o fim da gestão da professora Liz Andries. Então, foi desta maneira que, após o início da minha participação no Comitê Executivo, que nós começamos a conversar no Brasil sobre a criação da sociedade. Tecnicamente, foi mais simples para nós criar uma associação nova, ao invés de recuperar a antiga por problemas técnicos e jurídicos. Elegemos a primeira diretoria, fizemos o nosso primeiro congresso em 2017, aqui na USP, e agora chegamos, então, ao segundo congresso, que Na verdade, por nosso regulamento, deveria ter sido feito ano passado, mas em vista das dificuldades imensas que tivemos nesses tempos difíceis, nós estamos realizando agora em 2022. Bom, eu parabenizo muito a organização do Congresso, meus colegas de Aracaju, Antônio Carlos, Marcos e os outros, aos alunos que estão colaborando, e dizer que é muito significativo o número de pessoas que se inscreveram para apresentar trabalhos. São mais de 120 pessoas que vão apresentar trabalhos. Hoje de manhã eu assisti a 3 mesas na Sala Rousseau, e eram trabalhos de grande qualidade, de pesquisadores muito jovens, o que significa que nós estamos, além de continuar o trabalho da tradição dos estudos do século XVIII no Brasil, nós estamos recebendo gerações de novos pesquisadores que estão fazendo trabalhos com muita dedicação e trabalhos muito sérios. Eu queria dizer também que há representantes de 20 universidades brasileiras entre os professores e alunos que vão apresentar trabalhos. A grande maioria das universidades públicas, estaduais e federais, algumas universidades privadas, como a PUC do Rio de Janeiro, como a PUC de São Paulo e a FAAP. Portanto, há 20 universidades representadas nesse nosso congresso, de oriundos que vieram de todas as regiões do Brasil, todas. No norte, com os representantes do Pará e do Acre, no nordeste, com representantes de praticamente todos os estados do nordeste, no centro-oeste, Brasília e Goiânia, no sudeste e no sul. Poucos estados não estão representados neste grupo que está participando do Congresso. Portanto, é com muita alegria, com muito contentamento, parabenizando todos os colegas da organização, que eu digo que o Congresso certamente será um sucesso, será ocasião de intercâmbios, de trocas, de conversas que poderão dar origem a novas atividades de cooperação entre os pesquisadores brasileiros, entre os pesquisadores brasileiros e os colegas convidados de outros países, da Inglaterra, da Itália, da Argentina, de Portugal, que enviaram representantes. E eu desejo a todos ótimos trabalhos, ótimas conversas, ótimos debates em torno dos temas que nos são caros, Certamente vocês leram a justificativa apresentada para o tema do Congresso. Nós julgamos que, nesses tempos difíceis que nós estamos vivendo, não apenas em vista dos problemas sanitários, dos problemas de saúde causados pela Covid, que ainda está aqui, mas também problemas políticos graves que o Brasil está vivendo, que repercutem no aumento da desigualdade, que repercutam no aumento, na limitação da liberdade política, tendo em vista também a situação mundial, que também não é boa, com a ameaça de guerra e de expansão da guerra, que nós pedimos aproveitar a oportunidade do Congresso para, a partir dos nossos estudos sobre os temas das luzes, refletir também um pouco sobre os temas que, hoje em dia, nos deixam perplexos e nos convidam à reflexão. Então, eu termino aqui. Bom congresso. Muito obrigada pelo comparecimento de todos que vão apresentar trabalhos. Sejam bem-vindos também aqueles que estão acompanhando os trabalhos e que nós tenhamos os próximos 3 dias de muito trabalho, de muita cooperação e de muita amizade. É isso.
Obrigado, Maria das Graças, pela acolhida, né? E agora, antes de eu passar à professora Maria, eu gostaria de continuar os meus agradecimentos, né, ao CAFIO, que está nos acompanhando, nos dando um suporte imprescindível para o bom desenvolvimento do nosso evento. Muito obrigado, viu, pessoal do CAFIO. Eu gostaria, então, de passar a palavra à professora Penelope. Penelope Corfield, ela é professora de História da London University e vai falar para a gente sobre o iluminismo experimental da Grã-Bretanha. Penelope, it's with you now. Thank you so much for your support, for you have here. Thank you. Many thanks.
So now it's me. Bom dia a todos.
Bom dia.
Estou feliz em me juntar a todas vocês e com minha estimada colega, Professor Maria das Graças. But, my friends, now I must proceed in English. And of course, I extend my welcome again. And I apologize for the technical hitch, which makes me a woman of mystery. But I can still give my presentation. And my subject is Great Britain's Experimental Enlightenment. My talk draws from evidence from all corners of the British Isles in the 18th century. The ferment of ideas was very widely shared. London and Birmingham were obvious centres of debate and experimentation, but also were Glasgow and Edinburgh. And to a lesser but also significant extent, so were Dublin and Belfast, and a host of smaller urban centres too. They were collectively developing a fertile and lively culture marked by experimentalism and a lack of dogma. The following discussion addresses three central aspects of the British Enlightenment and assesses their message for modern dilemmas. Now, my first bit then is cultural optimism. Now, public opinion in 18th century Britain was certainly far from homogeneous. There was a strong strand of pessimism. Fears about national decline were frequently expressed, especially in times of danger. And when Britain was doing badly in overseas wars, especially when fighting against neighbouring France, the outpourings of anxiety reached a crescendo. Similar concerns were repeatedly voiced about collapsing public morality. Young men were, it was feared, becoming too effeminate. How could they fight well against France if they spent their time preening in smart clothes and enjoying debauched pleasures? And women were just as bad. How could they nurture their families if they were thinking only of balls and flirtations? Or even worse, if they were foolishly trying to write books? Above all, how could women carry out their traditional role of preserving morality if they were wearing provocative clothing and, in the 1790s, appearing in public in the fashionable thin and body-hugging dresses which left nothing to the imagination? One conservative commentator, named John Bowles, was emphatic about the dangers. In 1800, he declared melodramatically, never was the world in so calamitous or perilous a state as at present. And he particularly blamed women in their low-cut dresses. Female modesty is the last barrier of civilized society, he urged. When that is removed, what remains to stem the torrent of licentiousness and profligacy? So there were plenty of pessimists, and yet there was, alongside that, a rival strand of thought throughout this period. It was not unaware of social problems, yet it was broadly optimistic that solutions could be and would be found. And this stream of thought became increasingly confident and vocal over time. Common words of praise for optimists included philosophy, science, reason, liberality, the march of mind, and above all, light or enlightenment. Many examples can be cited, rising in a crescendo throughout the 18th century. The period was an age of the greatest light and knowledge that has been for above these 1200 years, wrote a happy commentator in 1748, meaning that British culture had been in darkness since the fall of Rome, dated approximately as 500 AD, but was now improving. And such references became standard. Here are some quotations. It was a happy era of experimental philosophy, decided another commentator in 1748. It was an age wherein every part of science is advancing to perfection, echoed a third in 1772. People at this time were more enlightened and informed than their ancestors ever were, added another in 1777. And again, it was an age of light and liberality as well as one of science and free inquiry, according to a political reformer in 1782. And optimists characteristically admired the accelerating growth of trade and towns in 18th century Britain. They applauded the relative freedom of choice for individuals about which church to attend under the Acts of Toleration. They did not kowtow, which means, to be obsequious. They did not kowtow to the rich and powerful, but these optimists took pride in their independence and dignity. When they met, and I'm talking about scientists, merchants, professional men, when they met, they shook hands. The new egalitarian style of greeting that was spreading among commercial and professional society. And logically, too, these optimists praised the spread of literacy and numeracy. They were delighted that talented people from humble backgrounds were making good in Georgian Britain in hitherto unprecedented numbers. And in particular, the advent of learned ladies, teased by Dr. Johnson as Amazons of the pen, was for optimists a matter for social congratulation, not for social alarm. In that spirit, an anonymous author in 1760 roundly scolded the pessimistic commentators. Humankind was wiser, happier, and better than it had ever been, he, or it may have been she, asserted, and scientific know-how was in a state of much higher perfection than ever before. And further euphoria came from the rationalist philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. The age we live in is a busy age in which knowledge is rapidly advancing towards perfection, he proclaimed in 1776. The result was that terms like light and reason were becoming common buzzwords uttered in praise. Another positive term was improvement. It was applied to plans for town refurbishment and to radical innovations in the transport infrastructure, like canal building. And by the early 19th century, progress was taking over as the predominant term in Britain, and the power of light was now held to be shining brightly, not just in the next world, but in this one. So that is my strand of cultural optimism. The related one is faith in applied science and technology. So this is my second theme. It particularly marks the ferment of ideas in 18th century Britain. And it is the stress not just upon reason, but also upon science and improvement. that is, applied reason. Certainly, liberal British thinkers shared the same concerns that were expressed by their continental counterparts across Europe. They too supported religious toleration, political rights, good access to education, economic advancement, social openness, and rational government. However, a very distinctive strand in Britain was the pervasive interest in discovering more about the natural world and experimenting with new ways of doing things. Furthermore, such concerns were not confined to advancing knowledge among the educated. Not confined to advancing knowledge in the abstract, not confined to the educated, to the purely high-flying elite circles either. Instead, there was much interest in applying new discoveries to practical day-to-day affairs. In that spirit, a 1769 guidebook called England Displayed reported gleefully that the traces of the busy hand of improvement, guided by genius and supported by industry, are visible in every corner of this flourishing island. And an architect agreed in 1771. A general spirit prevails for correcting ancient errors and establishing new improvements. Even the crusty literary pundit, Dr. Samuel Johnson, confirmed the trend in 1783, though with less enthusiasm. "Sir," he growled, "the age is running mad after innovation." Where would it all end? Well, the answer was an empirical scientific tradition which combined theory with practice. There are many examples. The great theoretical physicist Isaac Newton not only formulated the theory of gravity and did pioneering work in mathematics and optics, but also worked in his laboratory to build an innovative reflecting telescope. Its novel feature was the use of double mirrors to improve the vision. And this telescope, later known as the Newtonian reflector, was a prototype for many improved versions to follow. Another scientist who made advances in both theory and technology was the English astronomer Edmund Halley. He famously worked out the timetable of the recurrent Halley's Comet, which is projected to be visible from Earth again in 2061. And at the same time, he devised the first model of a magnetic compass, and he also built a pioneering diving bell, allowing divers to remain underwater for several hours. And sad to say, during a practical trial, Halley himself stayed down too long, and for his pains he surfaced with permanently damaged hearing. And moreover, a crucial counterpart to the work of the leading scientists was a widespread culture of innovation among artisans and craftsmen in their workshops, and of experimentation within ordinary households. All these worlds intersected. Books and magazines excitedly reported new discoveries, and information was also circulated via public lectures and scientific demonstrations where men and women joined the audiences together. And specifically too, the new scientific ideas were discussed and practically tested in many craft workshops, especially in the industrial regions. Dean Tucker of Gloucester, a clergyman who travelled widely to study Britain's economy, praised the spread of labour-saving inventions. England's industrial regions in the North and Midlands, he wrote in 1757, they exhibit a specimen of practical mechanics scarce to be paralleled in any part of the world. Every worker, he said, had a new pattern to propose or a new way of working to suggest. Now, clearly, Tucker's enthusiasm ran away with him here. Yet the general point remained that in Britain, Enlightenment faith in reason and science was closely linked with a culture of practical invention and innovation, shared in workshops and in scholars' laboratories alike. And enthusiasts for change were particularly delighted when experimental science led to inventions which assisted industrial production and transport technology. In particular, I mentioned earlier canal building, but that was nothing to the excitement that was attached to the harnessing of steam to provide power for mechanical engines, which opened dramatic new vistas. So a poetic encomium in 1806 was rhapsodic. O rare invention, to thy skill we owe refinements our rough fathers did not know. And the Conservative politician George Canning was equally impressed. Thus, in a public speech in 1822, he declared steam to be a new and mighty power which walks the water like a giant rejoicing in his course, stemming alike the temperament and the tide. His admiration was palpable, and his covert biblical allusion to Christ walking upon the water added to the sense of wonder at an almost divine new power. The implications of these cumulative technological changes, which led to the industrialization of the economy, were not missed by perceptive contemporaries. Notably, in 1805, the poet Robert Southey provided a bold summary. The advent of the steam engine was, he declared, almost as great an epoch marker as the invention of printing. It was generating an entirely new manufacturing system. So contemporaries were well aware of these changes, and other great changes were happening too, in commerce, towns, the professions, and transport. So Southey argued that the country had undergone since the 1760s, that's 2 generations before his writing, a peaceful but fundamental transformation. The alteration extends to the minutest things, even to the dress and manners of every rank of society. And not to be outdone, Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish-born sage of Chelsea, was, a generation later, even more emphatic. 19th century Britons did not, he declared, live in an historical, devotional, philosophical, or moral age. Instead, he continues, it is the age of machinery in every outward and inward sense of that word. Reason in application to solving practical problems appeared, I stress, to be the answer to the world's problems. So my third theme is Britain's embracing of empiricism. Changes in science and technology gave a mighty boost to the already existing British culture of empiricism. Trial and error, a phrase first recorded in 1806, became the watchword. Experimentalism sprang from that heritage and further ingrained it very deeply. Empiricism became a British cultural mantra, which it still remains. Mistakes and the correction of mistakes applied both to scientific theory and to technological practice. The challenge was to weld creativity with realism and vice versa, to combine practicality with true innovation. Rational inquiry and debates were therefore seen as central to all forms of learning. And in fact, not every new scientific theory proposed in the 18th century was proved right in the long term. Undoubtedly, too, lots of experiments failed, at least the first time they were run. Scientists, therefore, regularly stress the need for rational testing, no waiting for miracles or thunderbolts from on high. The great physicist, Isaac Newton, who was spiritually devout, if theologically unorthodox, declared his confidence not in hypotheses, but in reason and experiments. And over a century later, Michael Faraday, who discovered electromagnetism and experimented with radical practical applications of the new power of electricity, had a challenging mantra, but still try, for who knows what is possible. So British empiricism was becoming culturally consolidated. It was taken to signify the avoidance of dogmatic extremes. It also inculcated a equal willingness to apply ad hoc measures to solve problems and to amend or abandon such measures if they did not work. Politically, too, this empirical attitude encouraged the arts of compromise. British pragmatism was often compared by the British, favourably, especially by the British, with foreign extremism. Many people in the 18th century look back with horror at the turmoil and bloodshed of Britain's 17th century civil wars. Fighting over rival and political principles seemed absurd. That attitude did not stop all civil conflict. The American colonists in 1776 were certainly sure it was worth fighting to escape British control. But still, many Britons preferred to avoid all extremes. Traditional conservatives were happy to leave things as they stood, and most British reformers in this era were committed to gradual, not revolutionary change. Philosophically, a cultural belief in trial and error also fostered the case for rational debate. John Locke, the influential Whig theorist and educationalist, paved the way by arguing that knowledge comes not from innate, preformed ideas, but from experience, as interpreted by human reason. The stress upon experimentation, accompanied by rational and impartial assessment, was shared by many thinkers who otherwise disagreed with one another. The visionary poet and artist William Blake was deeply critical of both John Locke and Isaac Newton, believing their theories to be too mechanistic and lacking in true emotion. Yet Blake's own maxim was actually very Newtonian. The true method of knowledge is experiment, he argued, while developing his own creative mix of radical religion, Kabbalistic theories of knowledge, and a naturalistic lifestyle. So people from different sides of the spectrum would focus upon experiment. So overall, therefore, the British contribution to the broad currents of Enlightenment thought was typically undogmatic and experimental. This attitude led Britain's creative thinkers in many different directions, but it simultaneously united them in opposition to extremes and in admiration for trial and error. Well, now, individual actions and attitudes in 18th century Britain were far more diverse than a pure and single-minded rationalist might demand. Cultural frameworks, after all, provide only frameworks. Nevertheless, such structures are insidiously powerful. The need to test everything was becoming axiomatic. One example from 1811 shows the sort of attitude that horrified traditional religious thinkers in Britain. Shelley, the young romantic poet, wrote a tract called The Necessity of Atheism, published in 1811, and in it he stated coolly that God is an hypothesis, and as such stands in need of proof. Everything, even religious fundamentals, seemed open to challenge. Shelley did in fact face much criticism, and he was expelled from his Oxford College. Nonetheless, he was not brought before the courts on a charge of blasphemy, which under English law at that date would have resulted in a fine and imprisonment if convicted. And that leniency was in marked contrast to the fate, just over 100 years earlier, of a young student at Edinburgh University. The 20-year-old Thomas Aikenhead was accused of ridiculing the scriptures, rejecting the Trinity, and declaring a preference for Mohammed over Christ. He was forthwith convicted of blasphemy under Scottish law and hung. There were many appeals for clemency, which were all ignored. Yet Aikenhead was the last person in Britain to be put to death as a blasphemer. A degree of cultural toleration and legal pragmatism was producing a changed set of attitudes long before Scotland's death penalty for blasphemy was repealed in 1825. So I've been giving the picture of a flexible and experimental set of attitudes, much of which is spreading into society as a whole. So my conclusions. Britain's experimental enlightenment would urge, keep trying, learn. Wait a minute, have I missed a page? Britain's experimental enlightenment would urge, keep trying, learn from errors. If you fail at first, then try again, but slightly differently and preferably better. Such an attitude was admirable in many ways, and indeed it was necessary in order to turn radical experiments into practical innovations. Inventors need great patience to dream up new possibilities and then to fine-tune them into realities. At the same time, however, adventurous experimentation needs to be kept under constant scrutiny. Innovations are by definition new and may therefore have new consequences. Many of those may be unintended, and a proportion of those surprise outcomes may well be malign ones. Mary Shelley provided a famous warning in fictional form. Her novel Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, published in 1818, offered a powerful mix of Gothic horror and science fiction, and subsequent filmmakers have responded imaginatively to her vision. Her basic message warns against scientific over-ambition without thinking sufficiently of the potential consequences. Prometheus was the legendary figure who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mortals, with epic consequences, both good and bad. In Shelley's fable, the modern Prometheus is a young experimenter named Frankenstein. He uses the power of electricity to spark new life, yet the result is unhappy, both for the monster thus created and for the over-sanguine experimenter. Frankenstein has played with fire and gets burned. Of course, this work was fiction. Mary Shelley could have written a happy ending had she wished, but her message was that experimental daring entailed a journey into the unknown. Moral considerations thus come into play. Not everything that can be done by humans should necessarily be done. Societies accept or disbar certain courses of action. One example of slowly changing public attitude can be documented in the course of the 18th century. For a long time, British traders' participation in the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans was accepted. It was something that seemingly happened far away, and slave traders declared correctly that their business was profitable. Owners of sugar plantations argued, equally accurately, that there was a large and keen consumer market for the sugar and rum produced from their raw materials. Nevertheless, empirical solutions to the need for labour in the New World went only so far. A deeper question asked, is it ever morally right for one set of humans to enslave others in order to profit from their enforced labour? It was a crucial question then, as it remains today. But public opinion in Georgian Britain began to change, slowly, as campaigners for abolition used press, pamphlets, images, and medallions to alert people of the horrors of the trade, and later of the institution to attack the institution of slavery itself. And above all, campaigners used the optimistic Enlightenment narrative of progressive change to reproach their fellow Britons. They were failing to live up to the promise of the times. We, in an enlightened age, wrote William Fox in 1791, have greatly surpassed in brutality and injustice the most ignorant and barbarous ages. And while we are pretending to the finest feelings of humanity, we are exercising unprecedented cruelty. Well, reproaches such as that stung all those who admire their own modern times. And a similar emphasis was supplied by the leading African abolitionist, Olaudah Equiano, himself a former slave. Freedom for the sable people, he urged in 1789, was essential in this era of light, liberty, and science. And it was notable that he placed liberty between the two other key Enlightenment buzzwords, light and science. Values counted alongside utility and pragmatism. The truly enlightened package had to include anti-slavery, as public opinion in Britain and also elsewhere came increasingly to accept. The next problem, which remains a live one today, is to enforce anti-slavery worldwide. But still, establishing humanist values that are accepted by all and applied to all is the biggest Enlightenment challenge. So I allowed myself to finish with 3 further reflections, all brief. 1, shared cultural optimism has many benefits. It spreads good cheer, it helps to reassure people when facing problems that solutions can be found, and it encourages thinkers, experimenters, and activists to find remedies, whether old or new. However, an unthinking good cheer can become complacent. Optimism of the will needs to be tempered, at least to a degree, with what Antonio Gramsci specified as pessimism of the intellect. Second point, experimentalism is also exciting, adventurous, and often productive. However, that culture also needs rational assessment. Do innovations help the few, the many, or all, or harm them in the short run and or in the long run? It's especially vital that such audits are made in every generation, as innovations may have cumulative consequences that become fully apparent only over time. Inventions should thus mark the start of a process of rational assessment, not its ending. And just a note, plastics, synthesized from naphtha in oil, may be now developing a Frankensteinian capacity to haunt humans, as microplastic residues are now starting to contaminate marine environments and ultimately global food chains. So last point, empiricism. Flexibility and pragmatism are useful qualities in many contexts, but again, they need to be put into a moral framework. Anything goes is not an adequate guide for organizing a just world. To repeat a point already made, not everything that can be done should actually be done. As a global species, humans need, for their ultimate survival, a globally shared set of pro-humanist values. And then they have to put them into practice. Not easy. Yet, to update Gramsci, they can approach the challenge with an optimism of the will, a flexible invention of the means, a critical rationalism of the intellect, and a shared humanity in both heart and mind. So there we are. Então, essa é minha mensagem. Adeus a todos e vamos todos permanecer otimistas e inteligentes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penelope. we will we will start intelligent optimist.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you. Muito obrigado a todos que estão aqui presentes. Nós combinamos com a Penelope não haver questões, porque ficaria difícil a tradução, e, de qualquer modo, o texto será publicado brevemente, de algum modo ele será publicado, com todas as conferências dos nossos convidados. Então, vocês certamente serão notificados, sobretudo aqueles que são filiados à ABES. Eu aproveito o ensejo, nesse encerramento dessa primeira mesa, eu convido quem já é filiado, continuar, renovar a anuidade com a associação, e quem não filiar-se à nossa associação, que ela é ainda iniciante, digamos assim. Nós ainda não estamos nos 10 anos, brevemente faremos, e a gente quer, na verdade, somar esforços para a gente consolidar uma associação de estudos do século XVIII. Tá? Então, agradeço mais uma vez a todos. Penelope, many thanks. I'm very, very grateful for you, for your presence virtually.
Yes.
And,
tell everyone, if they wish to email me with a comment or question, I'm very happy to get responses.
Ok. Então, não sei se vocês entenderam, mas se vocês tiverem dúvidas, podem enviar um e-mail para a professora Penelope, que ela tem o maior prazer em responder. Então, eu convido a todos a continuar no nosso evento, na próxima sala. A cada mesa tem uma sala específica, isso para que não houvesse interferência de uma mesa sobre a outra. Então, nós vamos encerrar esta mesa agora, e daqui a pouquinho nós vamos começar a próxima mesa, sempre nesse canal do programa de pós-graduação da Universidade Federal de Sergipe. Muito obrigado a todos, até daqui a pouco.